The silence of Boston, Massachusetts at 2 a.m. was thick and unnerving. A cold wind whipped off the Charles River, whistling through the glass canyons of the city's high-rises. It was a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath, the calm before an inevitable storm. Most of the city was soundly asleep, oblivious to the terrifying scream that had just torn through the night. Detective Alex Reed sat with his feet propped on his desk, bathed in the cool glow of his computer monitor. Late nights were his old friends. On his screen was the smiling face of Anna Murphy, a 25-year-old woman who had vanished a week ago. The case file was a puzzle with no missing pieces, yet it made no sense. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle in her apartment. The only strange detail was a bizarre drawing on her bedroom wall. A shadowy figure with no defined shape, only 2 eyes that seemed to burn with an unsettling light. It looked like the work of a madman, not an artist. At 7:30 a.m., his phone buzzed. It was a junior detective on the other end, his voice tight with urgency. "Sir, we have a new case. A body was found in an old warehouse near the Salt Lake." A familiar dread curled in Alex's gut. He was on his feet in an instant. The scene was a chaotic tableau of flashing lights and police tape. The abandoned warehouse felt like a tomb. As he stepped inside, the stench of decay hit him, thick and sickening. And then he saw her. The body on the floor was Anna Murphy. But it was Anna in name only. Her body was grotesquely twisted, her limbs bent at unnatural angles, as if her bones had been shattered to powder. But the most horrifying detail was the expression on her face. Terror. Pure, unadulterated terror. The kind of fear that suggested she had stared into the very face of something evil in her final moments. This was no ordinary murder. It was a statement. The killer was sending a message. His feeling was confirmed when he saw a strange symbol carved into Anna's chest, a symbol that mirrored the shadowy figure from her apartment wall. To help him with this twisted case, Alex was paired with Dr. Lauren Kane, a young and brilliant psychologist. She examined the evidence with a meticulous eye. The killer didn't just physically assault her. He broke her psychologically first, Lauren explained. He preys on their deepest fears. Anna was terrified of losing what she loved most, and the killer used that against her. Lauren's words triggered a distant memory for Alex, a childhood accident that left him with a deep-seated fear of the dark. He still slept with a light on. He couldn't shake the feeling that this killer targeted people just like him, people who were vulnerable to their own fears. In the following days, 2 more bodies were found. A journalist named Robert Dennison and a teacher named Catherine Parsons. Both were mutilated in the same manner as Anna, with the same unsettling symbol carved into their bodies. Robert Dennison feared losing his career. He was strangled with his own laptop cord, and the words "You have lost" were scrawled across his body with a pair of scissors. Catherine Parsons was afraid of loneliness. She was found locked in an empty room, a small piece of paper around her neck that simply read, "You are alone." Her death was ruled a heart attack, the result of sheer terror. In every case, the killer had weaponized the victim's deepest fears. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that this killer wasn't just a man. He was a phantom, a whisper in the dark. The city had already christened him the Shadow Man, believing he was a lurking presence who killed in the dead of night. One evening, as Alex and Lauren revisited the case files, Lauren noticed a recurring detail. At each crime scene, a small, intricate drawing of that same shadowy figure had been left behind. As she studied the pictures, she realized they looked like something drawn from a mind's eye. "Alex," she said, her voice tight with a newfound understanding. "These drawings aren't just symbols. They're a reflection of the victims' minds. The Shadow Man can read his victims' minds." Alex stared at her, stunned. How is that possible? No one can read minds. "A psychopath can," Lauren stated, her gaze unwavering. "The Shadow Man is a psychopath who finds his victims' weaknesses and uses them to destroy them." Alex felt a grim sense of certainty. They were on the right track. But how do you catch a shadow? To find the Shadow Man, they would have to delve into the mind of a monster. But the question remained. Could they do that without losing themselves in the process? The night air in Boston had a new kind of chill. It wasn't just the cold from the river, but a creeping dread that had settled over the city. The media had a field day with the Shadow Man story, creating a new kind of terror. Everyone looked at their neighbor with suspicion, wondering if the next victim would be them, or if the killer was already a shadow in their own life. Detective Alex Reed and Dr. Lauren Kane had set up their base of operations in a cramped, stuffy room at the precinct. They were surrounded by stacks of files, crime scene photos pinned to corkboards, and the stale smell of coffee. They knew the next kill was coming. The Shadow Man's pattern was clear. He struck every few days, leaving a trail of bodies that were more than just victims. They were messages. "He's getting bolder," Lauren said, pointing to a photo of Catherine Parsons' body. The "you are alone" note. It's not just about her fear, it's about his own. He sees himself in them. Alex looked up from a stack of forensic reports. "What do you mean?" "The Shadow Man is likely a deeply isolated individual," she explained, her voice low. "He doesn't just exploit fear. He projects his own loneliness onto his victims. He's not just killing them, he's punishing them for what he lacks." The journalist, Dennison, feared professional failure. The killer might see his own life as a failure. The teacher, Parsons, feared loneliness. He is likely an extremely lonely person. Suddenly, a realization hit Alex with the force of a physical blow. The three victims weren't just random. Anna Murphy, the first victim, had been afraid of losing what she loved most. Her boyfriend James had broken up with her just a month before her disappearance. Robert Dennison, the journalist, had recently been fired from a major newspaper, and Catherine Parsons, the teacher, was a widow whose son had recently moved to a different city. "They're all people who experienced a major loss right before they were killed," Alex said, a new energy buzzing through him. "A breakup, a job loss, a son leaving home. The Shadow Man isn't just preying on fear. He's targeting people who are already at their most vulnerable, at a moment of significant emotional pain." This new lead gave them a glimmer of hope. They started sifting through public records and social media, looking for anyone who had suffered a similar recent loss and had a connection to the victims. The list was long, and time was running out. That night Alex went home, but he couldn't rest. The new theory was consuming him. He thought about his own fears, the ones he had battled his whole life, the accident, the darkness. For the first time, he felt a strange, unsettling connection to the victims. He wasn't just investigating a case. He was seeing the face of his own fear reflected in their eyes. He woke up with a jolt at 3 a.m. to the piercing ring of his phone. It was Lauren. Her voice was strained, barely a whisper. "Alex, you need to come to the lab. I found something. It's about the symbol." He got there as fast as he could. Lauren was hunched over a microscope, her face pale. On the screen was a magnified image of the symbol carved into one of the victims. "I ran a chemical analysis on the residue from the carvings," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It's not just blood. There are traces of something else, a chemical compound used in medical treatments, specifically in psychiatry." Alex's heart hammered against his ribs. "What kind of treatment?" "It's a drug used to treat severe psychiatric disorders, often related to trauma and deep-seated phobias," Lauren explained, her eyes wide with a grim understanding. "But what's more, the pattern of the carving. It's a topographical map. It's a map of a small town. And the center of the carving, the heart of the symbol, is a specific address." They cross-referenced the symbol with the map. It led them to an old abandoned mental institution on the outskirts of Boston, a place that had been shut down for decades. The address was where the Shadow Man lived. It was where he had likely been a patient. It was where his own fears were born. As they drove out to the desolate, crumbling building, the moon hid behind a cloud, plunging the landscape into complete darkness. Alex felt a tremor of fear, a primal unease. He was a detective, trained to face criminals, but this was different. This wasn't just a man, it was a living embodiment of terror, a monster shaped by his own pain. "He knows we're coming," Lauren whispered, as if reading his mind. "He's been watching us. He knows our fears." Alex pulled the car up to the gates of the asylum. A rusty sign creaked in the wind. Blackwood Asylum. The front doors of the institution stood wide open, like a gaping mouth waiting to swallow them whole. It was an invitation. The shadow man was waiting. And as they stepped out of the car, a low, guttural laugh echoed from deep within the asylum, a sound that seemed to come not from a throat, but from the very darkness itself. The air inside the Blackwood Asylum was thick with the scent of decay and dust, a symphony of creaking floorboards and distant, whispering winds. Alex and Lauren moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every sound amplified to a terrifying degree. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a cold hand on the back of Alex's neck. He clutched his pistol, its familiar weight the only anchor in the rising tide of his fear. They were following a trail of clues the shadow man had left for them. In a moldy, abandoned common room, they found the words, "Fear is a choice," scrawled on the wall in what looked like dried blood. It was a taunt, a cruel game. A sudden noise made them both jump. A chair scraped across the floor in a room down the hall. They moved towards it, flashlights raised. Inside, the room was filled with old psychiatric equipment, rusted and broken. A single working television sat on a table, its static-filled screen illuminating a lone chair in the center of the room. As they watched, the static cleared, replaced by a flickering, grainy video. It was Alex's childhood home. The footage was from a hidden camera showing him as a boy sitting in a dark room, huddled in fear after his accident. The video ended, and the screen went back to static. Alex felt a surge of rage mixed with a familiar, chilling dread. The shadow man wasn't just observing. He was inside his head, preying on his deepest, most personal fear. He was using Alex's past against him. "He knows," Alex whispered, his voice tight. "He knows what happened to me. He knows I'm afraid of the dark." "It's not about the darkness, Alex," Lauren said, her voice a steady calm in the chaos. "It's about the feeling of being trapped, the feeling of being powerless. He wants you to feel what his victims felt." Suddenly, a door slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into total darkness. The single television went black. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs, his breath catching in his throat. His training told him to stay calm, but his body was screaming, trapped by the primal terror of the dark. He could feel a presence in the room with them, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Lauren?" he called out, his voice a little too loud. There was no answer. His flashlight was gone. The weight of his pistol felt too heavy. He was alone, isolated in the blackness. He could hear something breathing, a slow, raspy sound, just a few feet away. He stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the wall, his mind a whirlwind of panicked thoughts. He saw his own face reflected in the darkness, the face of a terrified little boy. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm him, Lauren's voice came from the darkness, a clear, sharp sound. "He's not real, Alex. Don't look at him. Don't let him in." Her words cut through his fear. He closed his eyes, shutting out the suffocating blackness. He focused on her voice, on her steady presence. He was a detective, not a child. He was in control. He took a deep breath, and another. The rasping breath he had heard was his own. The darkness was just a room. He opened his eyes and reached out. His hand brushed against a metal object. His pistol. He had it the whole time. He squeezed the grip, a flicker of cold confidence returning to him. He found his flashlight on the floor and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty room. There was no one there. A note was pinned to the wall with a rusty nail. It was a drawing of the same shadowy figure, but this time it was different. It had a name written below it, Adam. They ran through the asylum, following the clues. The name led them to an old patient records room. They found a file, Adam Thorne. Patient ID 473. His diagnosis was severe trauma and paranoid psychosis. The file detailed his childhood, filled with neglect and abuse. He was a recluse, a ghost. But the most chilling detail was that his file ended abruptly a year ago, with a note: patient discharged, no further follow-up required. Alex and Lauren looked at each other, a horrifying realization dawning on them. The Shadow Man wasn't just a monster born of a disturbed mind. He was a failure of the system. He was a man who had slipped through the cracks, left to fester in his own pain until he decided to take revenge on a world that had abandoned him. They found him on the rooftop, silhouetted against the pale glow of the city lights. He was a small, unassuming man, his face a mask of profound emptiness. He held a small knife in his hand, the same type used to carve the symbols on his victims. "I tried to tell them," Adam said, his voice as hollow as the building itself. "I tried to tell them what was inside me, the shadows, but they didn't listen. They said I was cured. They let me go." "Adam, you have to stop," Alex said, his hand on his pistol. "I'm not the one who needs to stop," Adam replied, a chilling smile on his face. "I'm just a mirror. I'm just showing everyone what's really inside them, the fear, the darkness." He lunged forward, not at them, but towards the edge of the roof. Alex ran forward, tackling him just as he was about to jump. They tumbled to the ground, the knife skittering away into the darkness. As Alex held him down, Adam looked up at him, a flicker of something new in his empty eyes. "You're just like me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're a shadow too. You just don't know it yet." The police arrived moments later, their sirens wailing in the distance, a loud, hopeful sound that pushed back the silence. Adam Thorne was taken into custody, and the city could finally breathe again. The reign of the Shadow Man was over. But as Alex drove home that night, the words of Adam Thorne echoed in his mind. He looked at his own reflection in the car's window, seeing a man who had faced his fears but hadn't quite conquered them. He was a detective, a hero in the eyes of the city. But in the dark, he was still just a boy, afraid of the monsters in the shadows. He knew the Shadow Man was gone, but the fear he had exposed, the shadows in his own heart, were still there, waiting. The town of Silent Grove, Maine, was a lie. The name suggested peace, but the air was thick with a rustling whisper from the vast, ancient forest that surrounded it, and a low, persistent hum of fear. Towering maple and pine trees stretched toward the sky, their thick canopy blocking out much of the sunlight, leaving the town in a perpetual state of bruised, ethereal twilight. This was where Detective Dan Smith, seeking refuge from the chaos of his old life, had come for quiet. He found none. The first body was discovered 3 miles deep in the woods by a hiker. Dan and his team arrived to find a scene that defied explanation. High up in the branches of a massive oak, a woman's body hung, a terrifying tableau against the gray sky. As Dan approached, his gut clenched. The body wasn't just suspended, it had been meticulously arranged, like a gruesome marionette. Her limbs were tied with thin cord to the branches, as if an invisible puppeteer were controlling her. Her face was twisted into a grotesque mask of terror, eyes wide and staring. It looked as though, in her final moments, she had witnessed something no one should ever have to see. Shallow cuts marred her skin, like strokes from a madman's knife. The victim was identified as Laura Jenkins, a local school teacher. Near the base of the tree, on a small mound of dirt, Dan found a bizarre signature, a small hand-carved wooden doll. Its eyes were 2 empty hollows, and its face held the same distorted expression as the victim. The town, for all its quiet charm, was rife with gossip. As the news of the murder spread, a palpable dread settled over its inhabitants. Dan knew this wasn't a case he could solve with just forensics. He needed to understand the town's hidden soul. His search led him to Josie Carter, a young folklorist who had a small, cluttered house filled with books and charcoal sketches. She looked at him without surprise. "I know why you're here, detective," she said, her voice calm and steady. Laura Jenkins, right? How? Dan asked, taken aback. This town isn't as silent as it seems. There's a story in the woods passed down for generations. They say the trees here speak. They judge liars and traitors. Dan's initial reaction was to dismiss her as eccentric. Legends don't catch killers, Miss Carter. This one does, she replied with a small smile. To understand this killer, you have to understand the legend. Come here. She showed him a hand-drawn map of the woods with specific locations marked. People have done terrible things in these places. This is where a man betrayed and murdered his friend. And this spot, where Laura's body was found, is where a local man cheated on his wife. The locals have avoided these places ever since. Dan found her story unbelievable, yet a chilling pattern was emerging. The killer was staging their murders at sites linked to historical transgressions. 2 days later, the second murder occurred. This time, the victim was Martin Thorne, a prominent local businessman found in his backyard. His body was also posed like a puppet, limbs tied to metal rods. A horrifying grin was stretched across his face, as if someone had forced it there. A note was pinned to his chest, simply stating, "Your greed has been your end." Again, a small wooden doll was left behind, but this one's lips were stitched shut. Martin Thorne was a notoriously greedy man who had cheated his business partner out of everything. His betrayal was an open secret in the town. Josie's words echoed in Dan's mind. The killer wasn't just murdering. They were acting out a twisted form of justice, targeting liars and traitors. But why? He returned to Josie's house, a sense of urgency in his step. You were right, Josie. The killer is using the legends. But who are they and why? Josie pulled out an old, crumbling book with yellowed pages. This book contains some of Silent Grove's earliest stories. There's a legend about the Whispering Woods. It says the spirits of the woods turn those who sin into puppets. These are just stories, Dan insisted. Maybe, she said quietly. But this killer believes them. They see themselves as an agent of the woods. With each killing, they're telling a new chapter of a story that reveals the town's secret sins. To catch them, we have to understand their story, detective. And this story is buried deep within this town. A cold, creeping dread settled in Dan's heart. He was beginning to realize that this case wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about unearthing a darkness that no one in Silent Grove had dared to acknowledge. The crumbling pages of the old book smelled of dust and forgotten secrets. Dan and Josie hunched over it in the dimly lit silence of her living room, the town's quiet now feeling like a prelude to a scream. The book, titled The Founding of Silent Grove, was less a history and more a collection of oral traditions and grim folk tales. As they read, a clearer picture of the town's dark past began to emerge. The legend of the Whispering Woods wasn't just a ghost story, it was rooted in a real event. A land dispute between the town's founding families and an outsider named Elijah Thorne. Thorne, a recluse who lived in the forest, refused to sell his land. The founders, driven by greed, lied about his intentions, claiming he was a threat to the community. They poisoned his crops, destroyed his home, and eventually drove him to a grim fate. The legend claimed that before he died, Thorne swore revenge, his spirit becoming the vengeful entity that would one day seek justice. They didn't just kill him, Detective, Josie said, her finger tracing a faded illustration of a man with a wild, haunted look. They silenced his truth, and now the puppeteer is forcing the town to face it. The parallels to the recent murders were too chilling to ignore. Laura Jenkins's secret affair, Martin Thorne's business fraud, both were lies that the killer was brutally exposing. They had to figure out who in Silent Grove was still tied to this old sin. The book listed the names of the founding families, and Dan cross-referenced them with the town's current prominent families. It was a who's who of Silent Grove's elite. As they worked, a call came in, cutting through the eerie silence. The town's historical society president, Eleanor Vance, a proud descendant of one of the founding families, was missing. Dan felt his blood run cold. The killer was now targeting those directly connected to the town's original sin. They found her body in the old town hall, a place steeped in the town's history of lies. Eleanor wasn't hung or tied to anything. She was propped up at a table, meticulously posed with a quill in her hand and an open ledger in front of her. Her head was tilted as if listening intently. Her face, frozen in a rictus of terror, was a silent testament to a horrifying end. Her ears had been grotesquely stretched and pinned back, a horrifying visual of a person forced to listen to a truth they refused to hear. Pinned to her dress was a note, written in the same elegant script as the ledger. It was a single line from the old legend, "The deaf will be made to hear." And there, on the table, was a new doll. This one was intricately carved, wearing a tiny, old-fashioned dress and with unnaturally large, protruding ears. "The puppeteer isn't just recreating the legend," Josie whispered, her voice trembling. "They're becoming a part of it. The way they've posed her. It's how they described Thorne's accusers in the book. They closed their ears to his pleas." They looked at the open ledger. It was a list of property records from the founding era, documenting the land grabs and shady deals made by the founding families. Eleanor had been researching this, maybe trying to hide it, maybe trying to expose it. Either way, the killer had found her. Dan's phone rang. It was the police chief, his voice full of panic. "Detective, get here now, the mayor's office. He's not answering his phone. His name is Henry Thorne." Dan and Josie froze. Thorne. The name of the man who had been betrayed centuries ago. The killer was making a direct connection. Henry Thorne, the mayor, was a descendant of the victim, not the perpetrators. The killer wasn't just a judge. They were a vengeful spirit, taking a life from the very bloodline that had been wronged. "The puppeteer isn't punishing a lie this time," Josie said, her eyes wide with dread. "He's punishing the last living link to the victim of the lie. The final puppet show is about to begin." Dan grabbed his coat, his mind racing. This was it. The climax. The last act of the play. The puppeteer wasn't just targeting the guilty. He was targeting the last person who could have spoken the truth. The killer was going to complete the ritual, and they were the only ones who could stop him. The police station was in utter chaos. Dan's mind raced, cutting through the panic of the chief. The mayor, Henry Thorne, is a descendant of Elijah Thorne. He's the killer's final target. He's not a villain in the story. He's the last living symbol of the victim's bloodline. This isn't a murder, it's a sacrifice. The chief, wide-eyed, stared at Dan. "What the hell are you talking about, Smith?" "I'm talking about the motive behind a century-old legend," Dan shot back. "We need to check the Thorne family property." But the mayor's house was empty. The office was quiet. Dan's phone buzzed with a message from Josie. "The ledger. The last entry isn't a person, it's an address. The old Thorne family cabin deep in the woods. The final chapter of the legend took place there." Dan and Josie drove to the edge of the forest, their flashlights the only beacons in the suffocating darkness. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers. The silence was louder here, a predatory living thing. They moved quickly, following an overgrown path that only a local would know. Ahead, a faint light flickered through the trees. It was the old, abandoned cabin. The door hung ajar, swinging on a single hinge. Inside, the scene was horrifyingly theatrical. Mayor Henry Thorne was tied to a chair in the center of the room, his mouth gagged, eyes wide with terror. A small, almost invisible thread was tied to his wrist, leading up to the rafters. Standing over him, holding a long wooden stick, was a man. He was old, with wild white hair and a gaunt face. In his hand, he held a small, hand-carved wooden doll. "The final act," the man said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "The last living piece of Elijah Thorne's legacy. I am here to make things right." "Silas Vance," Josie whispered, her eyes wide with recognition. A distant relative of Eleanor Vance. His family was cheated out of their land by the founders in the original dispute. "My great-grandfather was told he'd get a share of the land," Silas said, his eyes burning with a lifetime of resentment. "But they lied. just like they lied to Elijah. My family has lived in the woods, watching, listening to the secrets this town has been trying to bury. I was meant to be the one to tell the truth. But no one listens to a whisper from the woods. So you decided to make a statement, Dan said, keeping his voice calm, his hand inching towards his pistol. You decided to be the judge, the executioner. I am merely the puppeteer, Silas replied, raising his stick. I am making the town face its sins one betrayal at a time. The first two were just practice. This is the grand finale. Silas began to move the stick, making the thread tied to the mayor's wrist twitch. Henry Thorne's body flinched. The scene was surreal and terrifying. Silas wasn't just a killer, he was a deranged artist, a historian of the town's darkest secrets. What you're doing isn't justice, Silas, Dan said, trying to distract him. It's madness. This isn't Elijah's curse, it's your own. Silas faltered for a moment, his eyes losing focus. He was so consumed by his own narrative that he was losing track of reality. Seizing the opportunity, Josie lunged forward, grabbing a heavy lantern and swinging it at Silas. It hit him squarely, sending the stick and the doll flying across the room. Silas roared, a sound of pure rage and defeat. He grabbed a small knife from his belt and charged at Josie. Dan, his pistol now in hand, fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Drop the knife, Silas, he yelled. Silas hesitated, his eyes darting between Dan and Josie. In a final, desperate act, he turned and ran towards a back window, smashing through it and disappearing into the darkness of the woods he so loved. The sounds of sirens began to echo in the distance, cutting through the silence of the forest. Dan and Josie quickly untied the mayor, who was shaking uncontrollably. He was alive, but the experience had broken something inside him. The reign of the puppeteer was over. The police searched the woods and found Silas a short distance away, huddled and disoriented, clutching his wooden doll. He was taken into custody, and the secrets he had brought to light began to spread throughout the town. The lies of Silent Grove were finally exposed, not by a hero, but by a monster. As the sun rose over the silent woods, Dan stood with Josie, watching the police lights. He had solved the case, but something had changed in him. He knew that some darknesses can't be outrun. They just find you. He had come to Silent Grove for peace, but all he had found was the uncomfortable truth. Every town, no matter how quiet, has its secrets, and sometimes those secrets are just waiting for a puppeteer to bring them to life. The city was a monument to paradox. Millions of people, yet each lived in a digital bubble, connected to everyone and truly known by no one. It was a place of endless noise and profound silence. This was the city Detective Kara Jennings had worked in for 20 years, but she had never seen a crime scene like this. The apartment was a minimalist's dream: clean lines, polished chrome, and large windows overlooking the city skyline. It belonged to Chloe Davis, a 28-year-old social media influencer. Chloe lived a public life online, sharing every filtered moment, but in her immaculate home, she had died in a private, horrifying silence. The scene was baffling. There was no forced entry, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no weapon. Chloe lay on her bed, her body unmarked, her eyes wide open. The coroner's preliminary report stated the cause of death was a heart attack, but the expression on her face, a rictus of pure, unadulterated terror, told a different story. It was the face of someone who had seen a ghost. A rookie detective, new to the job, pointed to a glowing blue ring on the smart speaker on the bedside table. Detective. All her smart devices were on. The lights, the cameras, the thermostat, all active right up until the time of death. Kara grunted. She was old school. She trusted fingerprints and boot prints, not Wi-Fi signals. This tech stuff was a dead end as far as she was concerned, but her gut told her something was wrong. This wasn't a natural death. A final piece of evidence was found on Chloe's phone, a text message from an unknown number, received just moments before she died. It was a single emoji, a pair of empty, staring eyes. Frustrated by the lack of physical evidence, Kara was forced to consult the cybercrime unit. It was where she met Leon Carter, a young, bespectacled analyst who looked more at home in a virtual world than a real one. He barely looked up from his glowing monitors. Kara laid out the case, her tone laced with skepticism. "We have a dead girl and no motive. No signs of a break-in. It's like the killer just walked through the walls, Leon finally looked at her, a strange glint in his eyes. "They didn't break in, Detective. They logged in." He pulled up a screen showing the data from Chloe's apartment. It was a timeline of her last few minutes. The thermostat dropped to 30 degrees. The smart lights flickered, then went out. The security camera in her living room was activated, but it only recorded a static shot of the empty room. And the speaker. He paused and played an audio file. It was a distorted, whispered voice, barely audible, reciting a countdown. 5, 4, 3. The voice was inhuman, synthesized and chillingly calm. "The killer didn't need to be there," Leon explained, his voice low. "They hacked her network. They took control of her home. They manipulated her environment, her reality. They created a perfectly tailored horror movie just for her. The terror killed her, Detective, not a weapon." Kara stared at him, her tough-as-nails exterior cracking. The implications were chilling. A killer who could murder without touching their victim, who could turn a home into a psychological prison. The final text message, the staring eyes, was the killer's signature. A message from an unknown entity that had been watching her, living in the same house with her, but only in the digital world. This wasn't just a murderer. This was something new, something terrifying. The killer was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The killer was invisible. The official report on Chloe Davis's death read natural causes, but a cold, hard knot of certainty had formed in Kara's gut. Natural deaths didn't leave a trail of digital breadcrumbs and a face frozen in terror. The case was officially closed, but for Kara and Leon, it had just begun. They set up their own makeshift command center in an unused storage room at the precinct, a space littered with old files and the faint smell of forgotten dust. 2 weeks later, the silence was broken. A new victim, Leo the Titan Miller, a famous video game streamer with millions of followers, was found dead in his apartment. He was a digital celebrity, but in reality, he was a recluse who lived and worked from home. The crime scene was a chilling echo of Chloe's. A pristine apartment, a body with no physical wounds, a cause of death ruled as a massive coronary event, and an intricate smart home system that was fully active. Kara stood over the body, a deep sense of dread washing over her. "Another ghost, Leon?" she asked, her voice tight. Leon's face, usually calm and detached, was pale. He had already pulled the data from Leo's network. "Worse," he said, his fingers flying across a keyboard. "The killer's technique is more sophisticated. They didn't just hack in, they took full control of his network from the inside. They used his own Wi-Fi as their playground." Leon played the audio file he had retrieved from Leo's smart speaker. It was a terrifying sound, a chorus of distorted, whispering voices. They weren't speaking, they were screaming. The voices were all Leo's, taken from his past live streams, warped into a cacophony of fear and despair. "The killer didn't just scare him," Leon explained. "They made him listen to his own terror. They turned his own voice against him." The final piece of the puzzle was on Leo's gaming console, a cryptic text message from an unknown user, a new emoji, a blacked-out circle with a single white dot in the center. "The signature," Kara said, a horrifying realization dawning on her. "A new emoji for every victim. What do they have in common?" Leon's search history on his monitor was a web of obscure online forums and chat logs. "They were both members of the same online community," he said, pointing to a small, private forum for a niche sci-fi series. "It's for people who feel isolated in the real world. They find a home there, a place where they feel understood." "So the killer is one of them," Kara concluded, a cold certainty setting in. "They're killing people who use their online persona to mask their real loneliness." A chill ran down Kara's spine. This wasn't just a killer, it was a twisted idealist, a judge of human connection or lack thereof. The killer wasn't after revenge. They were making a statement about the hollow lives people lived, connected by a network but isolated by choice. As Leon delved deeper into the forum, he found something new. A thread created just moments ago by an anonymous user. The title was a series of emojis, the same two that had been found on the victim's devices, followed by a new one, a single question mark. The first post was a chilling countdown. "We don't have much time, Detective," Leon said, his voice now filled with a sense of urgency. "He's about to pick the next one. The killer is one of them and he's watching us. He's already in the room." Kara looked around the storage room, her hand on her sidearm, suddenly feeling a fear she couldn't explain. The walls were solid, the door was locked, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She knew the killer wasn't physically there, but in a world where a person could be a ghost in the machine, she no longer felt safe anywhere. The clock on Leon's computer screen was a ticking bomb. The anonymous user on the forum had posted a new message, a countdown to the next victim's demise. 3 hours. Kara paced the small storage room, her hand hovering over the half-eaten donuts on the table. "We have to find them, Leon. Now," she urged. "I'm trying," Leon said, his fingers a blur across the keyboard. "The forum is secure. The user's identity is completely anonymous. There are no patterns in the victim's public lives, no shared friends, no physical connection. Nothing." Then, an idea hit Leon. It was a long shot, a gamble. The killer isn't choosing them based on their physical lives. They're choosing them based on their online personas. What if we give him a new target? He started typing furiously, creating a new profile on the forum. He crafted a desperate post, filled with a manufactured loneliness that mirrored the victim's online personas. A plea for connection, a cry for help. An hour passed, then a message popped up on Leon's screen, a private message from the anonymous user. "You're not alone," the message read. "I see you. I see the loneliness. You're just a ghost in a sea of faces." The killer had taken the bait. Leon replied, and they began a chilling dialogue. The killer's messages were not those of a monster, but of a profoundly lonely person. They felt invisible in a world where everyone was performing, where the number of friends a person had online meant nothing in real life. "I am just showing them what it feels like," the killer wrote. "To be seen, and then to be forgotten. To be a ghost." Suddenly, the lights in the storage room began to flicker. The old thermostat whirred to life and the room grew cold. A chill ran down Kara's spine. The killer wasn't just talking to them. They were already there. "He's in our network," Leon said, his voice laced with a new kind of fear. "He's hacking us right now." A distorted voice came from a speaker on Leon's desk. It wasn't a countdown or a scream. It was a conversation, a chillingly familiar one. It was a recording of Kara and Leon's private conversation from the night before, their voices warped and twisted. "The killer is one step ahead," Leon said, his mind racing. "He's been listening to us the whole time." Then, Leon's phone buzzed. A text message. It wasn't from the killer. It was from his own smart home system. "Warning, unauthorized access detected. Door lock activated." The killer wasn't after a random victim anymore. The killer was after Leon. Kara drew her pistol, but it felt useless. What could a gun do against a ghost? "He's not here," Leon said, his eyes focused on his screen. "He's doing it all remotely. This is his final performance. He thinks he can outsmart us." As the killer manipulated the devices in Leon's apartment, Leon worked faster than ever before. He initiated a series of digital traps, a counter-hack, using the killer's connection as a tether. He bypassed the firewalls, traced the unique digital signature, and pinpointed the IP address. "Got him," Leon said, a grin of grim satisfaction on his face. "He's in a coffee shop downtown. An anonymous IP, but I found his physical address." They raced to a small, nondescript apartment building. They found the door unlocked. Inside, a single person sat in front of a bank of monitors, a simple coffee cup at their elbow. He was a young man, no older than 25, with a plain, unremarkable face. His hands flew over a keyboard, manipulating the digital world he had created. He was so engrossed in his work that he didn't notice them until Kara's pistol clicked. He slowly turned, his eyes empty. There was no terror in his face, no anger, just a strange sense of calm. "Now you see me," he said, his voice flat. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. He just sat there, the invisible man finally made visible. The city's silent horror ended that day, but a new one began. The killer was in custody, a normal-looking person who had managed to unleash terror through a network of connected devices. As Kara stood in Leon's apartment, looking out at the city lights, she no longer saw a place of connection. She saw a million tiny, isolated bubbles, each with a front door and a digital back door, all waiting for a ghost to walk through. The invisible killer was gone, but the chilling thought remained. The ghost was still in the machine. Los Angeles, California, is a city of a million little rituals. A city where people cling to their routines like life rafts in an ocean of anonymity. It's a city of 1,000 coffee shops, endless traffic, and a new kind of terror that lurks in the most mundane of places. Detective Sarah Jones, a woman whose life was built on meticulous patterns and predictable logic, was about to discover just how deadly a routine could be. The first victim was David Thorne, a 55-year-old accountant. He was a man of unyielding habits. Every morning at precisely 6:45 a.m., he bought a copy of the Los Angeles Times from the same newsstand on the corner of 5th and Main. He then, without fail, walked another 30 feet to a small secluded alley and read the front page over a cup of black coffee from his thermos. That morning, the newspaper lay on the pavement. David Thorne lay on the pavement as well, but his body was positioned with a horrifying precision. His head was submerged in a shallow puddle, and his face was twisted into a grotesque rictus. But the most disturbing detail was the placement of his body. It was posed as if he were reading his newspaper from the wrong side. The newspaper itself was gone. In its place on his chest was a small, smooth, white marble. Sarah arrived at the scene, her face a mask of professional calm. The medical examiner, a seasoned veteran named Mitchell Lee, shook his head. No sign of struggle. No obvious cause of death. It's almost clean. Then why did he die with that look on his face, Mitch? Sarah asked, her eyes fixed on the bizarre scene. And where's the paper? Mitch knelt down and carefully picked up the marble. That's not from here. It's polished, almost like a collector's item. The case was a puzzle with no clear pieces. David Thorne had no enemies, no known vices. His only crime, it seemed, was his predictability. 2 days later, the second body was found. The victim was a young woman named Maria Sanchez. Maria, too, was a creature of habit. Every morning, she would make a French press of her favorite coffee, using a specific ceramic mug, and sit on her porch to watch the sunrise. Her body was found inside her home just feet from the front door. She wasn't just dead, she was a macabre still life. A large coffee pot was overturned on her head, its contents still dripping down her face. Her favorite ceramic mug was nowhere to be found. Instead, a white marble, identical to the one found on David Thorne's body, lay on her forehead. This time, Sarah's stomach dropped. The horrifying pattern became clear. The killer wasn't targeting people, they were targeting habits. David Thorne's daily newspaper ritual, Maria Sanchez's morning coffee routine. The killer wasn't just a murderer, he was a collector, taking a piece of each victim's ritual as a gruesome trophy. It's about the routine, Sarah, Mitch said later at the precinct, examining the two marbles under a magnifying glass. The killer is choosing them based on what they do, not who they are. They find the most predictable part of their lives and exploit it. A cold dread settled over the precinct. This wasn't a criminal seeking revenge or money. This was a psychopath who had found a horrifying new game. A game where the most comforting parts of your life, the predictable morning walk, the daily commute, the cup of coffee, were the very things that could get you killed. The killer was out there, watching, waiting for the next person to follow their routine. The city's daily rhythm, once a comforting hum, now felt like a terrifying countdown. Sarah and Mitchell stood over the second victim, Maria Sanchez, the ceramic coffee pot a grotesque crown on her head. The twin white marbles, identical in shape and size, were their only link between the two cases. "He's not just taking a trophy," Mitchell said, holding the two marbles in his gloved hands at the lab. "He's collecting them. These aren't just smooth rocks. They're polished obsidian, and under the microscope I found something faint on each one." He displayed an image on a large monitor. The surface of the first marble had a series of microscopic grooves, so tiny they were almost invisible. On the second marble, he found a different set of marks. "They're not random," he said, his voice low with a mix of fear and fascination. "They're incredibly precise. I believe they're coordinates." The idea was chilling. The killer wasn't just staging a scene. They were leaving behind a breadcrumb trail. Sarah felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. If her theory was correct, the killer was already out there, watching for their next victim's predictable habit to begin. They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, a third victim was found. Brendan Wells, a high school track coach, had a habit he never broke. Every Tuesday morning at 5 a.m., he ran the same 2-mile route through the city park. He was found on a park bench, his body contorted. His face was pressed against a stopwatch, which was still running, its numbers frozen at 5i. The watch was an old, worn-out model that was always around his neck. The watch was gone. In its place, on his chest, was a third marble, a perfect match for the first two. Back at the lab, Sarah watched as Mitchell put the coordinates from all 3 marbles into his computer. The results were immediate. On a digital map of Los Angeles, 3 distinct points appeared. When he drew a line connecting them, a perfect, eerie triangle formed. In the dead center of the triangle, a single address appeared on the screen. It wasn't a home or a business. It was a dusty, abandoned building, the old Griffith Park Observatory. The center of his world, Mitchell whispered, his eyes wide. The place where he's watching them all. As they drove, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just about catching a murderer. It was about confronting a twisted mind. The killer wasn't looking for revenge or money. They were seeking a strange, insane kind of order. They entered the old observatory, its empty halls echoing with their footsteps. They found a small hidden room, its door ajar. Inside, the walls were covered with photographs of people engaged in their daily routines. A woman walking a dog, a man buying a newspaper, a young woman drinking coffee. Among them were David Thorne, Maria Sanchez, and Brendan Wells. In the center of the room, on a small table, was a collection. The Los Angeles Times newspaper from David's murder, Maria's ceramic coffee mug, and Brendan's stopwatch were all laid out meticulously. Next to them was a small journal. Sarah picked up the journal, her hands trembling. The handwriting was neat, precise. The entries detailed the routines of dozens of people, each one described with an obsessive, almost reverent detail. The killer wrote about how they found comfort in the predictability of these lives. But then, the tone turned dark. The most recent entries described a betrayal. David Thorne had been 1 minute late to his morning ritual. Maria Sanchez had used a different brand of coffee. Brendan Wells had paused for a second too long on his run. The killer saw these deviations as a betrayal of a perfect order. The murders were not about hate. They were about correction. The victims were being punished for breaking their own rules. Suddenly, a voice spoke from the shadows behind them, a soft, chilling whisper that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You've been watching my habits, detective, but I've been watching yours. And you just broke your biggest one. You didn't bring backup." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She spun around, her hand instinctively going for her pistol, but there was no one there. She was an expert at reading a crime scene, at identifying a threat, but this time, her senses were failing her. The voice came again, this time from the darkness of a stairwell behind them, a calm, unassuming tone. "It's a beautiful thing, isn't it? The perfect order of a life. The predictable rhythm." A man stepped into the faint light from the moon. He was small and slight, a thin man in a simple uniform. It was Arthur Finch, the night janitor for the observatory. He had been there all along, an unremarkable figure in the background of their investigation. He held no weapon. His hands were clasped in front of him as if he were just waiting to be seen. "I tried to tell them, you know," Arthur said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I watched them day after day, David with his newspaper, Maria with her coffee, Brendan with his stopwatch. They were beautiful in their precision. But then they broke the rules. They created chaos." He held up a small polished marble. "I had to correct them. Their lives were ruined by their own carelessness. I simply tidied up." The cold logic of his words was more terrifying than any threat. He saw his murders not as evil acts, but as a form of art, a way of restoring a broken pattern. He was the ultimate perfectionist. "And now you two," he continued, taking a step closer. "You're a creature of habit, detective. Always bring backup. But tonight, you broke your biggest rule. You brought chaos to my collection." Sarah and Mitch were trapped. Arthur had a small, custom-made tranquilizer gun holstered at his side. He didn't want to kill them quickly. He wanted to add them to his collection. "What do you want, Arthur?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her legs. "I want to make you a part of my collection. I want to put your routines in order, forever." As Arthur spoke, Sarah's eyes darted around the room. She looked at his meticulous collection, the newspaper perfectly folded, the coffee mug carefully placed. She saw his obsession, his need for order. This was his weakness. "You're a monster, Arthur," she said, her voice laced with contempt. "You're just a sad little man who can't handle a world that isn't perfect." Arthur's calm demeanor shattered. "It is perfect," he shrieked, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "You just have to follow the rules." In a flash of a second, Sarah moved. She didn't go for her gun. She went for his collection. She swept her hand across the small table, sending the carefully arranged newspaper, coffee mug, and stopwatch crashing to the floor. The ceramic mug shattered, and the newspaper's pages scattered everywhere. A scream tore from Arthur's throat. "No!" He stumbled forward, his obsession overcoming his caution. He dropped the tranquilizer gun and fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he tried to put the pieces of his broken collection back together. It was the opening they needed. Mitch, quick on his feet, grabbed the gun from the floor. He didn't hesitate. He shot Arthur in the neck and the killer went limp, collapsing face first among the broken pieces of his art. The sirens of the responding police cars filled the night. Arthur Finch, the collector, was taken into custody, babbling about the broken order he had tried to fix. The horrifying collection was documented and removed. As Sarah and Mitch stood outside the observatory, watching the police lights flicker against the city skyline, a profound realization settled over Sarah. The killer wasn't some evil mastermind in a lair. He was a janitor, an ordinary man who had made himself invisible by following a routine so strict that no one ever noticed him. The most terrifying monsters, she realized, aren't the ones who hide in the shadows. They're the ones who blend into the everyday, watching our every move. The horror was no longer in the unknown. It was in the routine,